How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Hello there, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. These are the inside stories, as we know, behind travel startups and innovation. I'm Kevin May from PhocusWire, and I'm joined as always by David Litwak. For this episode, we are really thrilled to be joined by Stuart Crighton. He's the co-founder and CEO at Cleartrip, which has its roots in India from way back. It probably now seems to Stuart back in 2006. Online travel agency, has done extremely well over the years, raised around 100 million, which actually some might argue these days is a fairly modest amount of money given the venture capital cash that's swilling around the industry these days. But 100 million since 2006. The company's now actually based in the Middle East, where Stuart is, and there are, as I said, its spiritual home is in India. But the success of the company since it took a focus into the Middle East operations is obviously why the company has shifted over to there. So thank you very much for joining us, Stuart. You're joining us from Japan today, but thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, right. So with all of our episodes, we like to ask our guests to give us a kind of a succinct answer to the question. Just tell us, how did you get here, Stuart?
Okay. Well, back in 1997, which is even further back, I ended up in India for what was going to be a short spell in an industry related to the energy sector. Spent a bunch of time there, sort of fell in love with India and the sort of accelerated story is, got very interested in the travel opportunity there, and ended up trying to get an OTA off the ground in the late 90s, was very unsuccessful, revisited that in about 2004 with my co-founders, and that was really the start of Cleartrip, which we launched in 2006.
That's a brilliantly short answer. We usually get to ones that are a lot longer than that, so that's great. Now we've got more time for questions. So, does it feel actually does 2006 actually feel like quite a long time ago now, given that, yes, it is 13 years, of course, but, that can feel like generations in internet years these days, can't it?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, yes, every year we have our sort of annual celebrations, and July the 4th, strangely enough, is when we launched in 2006. So I'm always running out of things to say about what it was like when we started, because it seems so far ago. But on the other hand, it's gone so enormously quickly, and you spend so much time completely immersed in what you're doing in the trenches, so to speak, that very, very rarely do you get a chance to pull your head up and look over and see what's going on. So yes, it's long in some senses, but in others it feels like yesterday, really.
And tell us, you referenced there when you were giving us your brief spiel on how you got here. You said you tried to launch an online travel agency business a few years beforehand. Can you just give us a kind of some background and detail on that kind of first attempt, if we can call it that, and what happened and what you kind of learned from that?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that should be very clear is I knew nothing about travel, and myself and my colleague actually put a business plan together back then that was called EasyGo, which you may remember from sort of Cox and Kings days of sort of over the last few years. And Cox and Kings were indeed a partner of ours, and we wrote that, and we tried to get that off the ground. Unfortunately, it was the sort of the back end of the sort of first internet explosion, if you like, in India. And I think more importantly, there really wasn't any infrastructure on the ground in India to support our type of business. There wasn't any really mobile infrastructure. There was no banking infrastructure. The dial-ups and et cetera were extremely choppy. And so from that perspective, we really had almost like a storefront, but a huge offline business model that was sort of being engineered behind that storefront to to give the illusion, I think, of being an internet business. And from that perspective, it was very, very tricky. But that wasn't unusual back then, frankly. A lot of businesses were like that. But I think that and the timing and the fact that we didn't know very much about travel probably all coincided to make it a very unsuccessful venture for us at that point.
And I mean, who were you looking towards? I mean, around that time you had Expedia was probably off the ground in the US and starting to make some moves on Europe, and obviously, Brent and Martha, what they were doing with lastminute.com. And did you, with the first thing that you were looking at, did you have kind of one eye on those brands to see how they were doing it, or did you think the market was so different in India that you had to kind of forge your own path?
Well, yeah, I think they were definitely inspiration. But as I said, I think the sort of infrastructure available in Europe and the US relative to the infrastructure that was available then in India were completely different. And as I said, I think we aspired to be like an Expedia or a Last Minute to some degree. And that was always our ambition. But the practicalities of trying to get it off the ground in India were very challenging for everything I mentioned earlier.
And so how long did you give it before you kind of, if dare I say, gave up?
Yeah, well, fortunately, it wasn't that long. So we spent probably about a year, maybe a little over a year, and really focus on trying to make this work. And we also, I mean, we got involved with an investment bank. We went out there to try and raise capital, and the conversations with the investors and et cetera back then was very odd. They were kind of looking at us like we're a little bit crazy. We were two foreigners in India trying to make this work, which was even more, amusing to most people. So, there's a combination of things that just meant that we were really not going to be very successful, I think. And that turned out to be the case, strangely.
And is this was this with Matthew that you did this one with?
Yeah, it is. So Matthew, for those who don't know, was the chief operating officer of Cox and Kings back then. He had a great sort of offline understanding of how travel was, and he'd obviously operated in the UK and India. So yeah, I relied on him totally to explain all the complications around travel. So he was great.
And obviously the experience of that first one didn't kind of put you off each other, because here you are, I guess 20 years later after launching Cleartrip, and you're still working together. Yeah,
well, he sort of moved on from Cleartrip many years ago, and
right.
he set up a really impressive thing called Magic Bus, which is a very large NGO in our part of the world. But yeah, look, he's a great mate, and we're very fortunate to work together. So yeah.
Stuart, David here. First of all, thanks for joining us today. I had a fairly simple question, which is, could you elaborate on what some of the key differences between operating in India versus, someplace like Europe or America? And I imagine there are issues around cash payment, level of rail penetration, and, Mozios and mobility. I know there's a bit of a long distance taxi industry that exists in India that doesn't exist very many other places. So I'd love if we could delve a little into kind of how you thought about how to attack the market in India versus elsewhere.
Well, I think the main focus for us, certainly in the early days, was two things: was the air market, the domestic air market, and the sort of domestic hotel market. So this is obviously going back from 2006 to 2008. The air market went through I guess, deregulation by the government, and we saw this in very accelerated increase of low-cost carriers come into the market, and up to that point, there'd really just been a sort of an Air India and a Jet Airways story that had been playing out. So the air market completely transformed. The interesting thing is that the expansion was really being led by, the Air Deccans and the Spices and the Indigos later on, et cetera. And there were a number of others that are no longer here. And so all these airlines were coming on, they were not using the GDS. And so you had a very fragmented market in terms of how you're accessing this content. The construct and architecture of how the air market was being built. I think that in some contexts was quite different from Europe. The accommodation market was the Wild West. I mean, this was completely fragmented over a very, very large area. such as India, no technology infrastructure on the ground. And so it was a very complex, nascent industry that we were trying to organize and bring on at the same time as organizing a very rapidly growing and rapidly transforming air market. So these were the two focus areas. I mean, later on in Cleartrip, we got involved in, a bunch of other things, activities and transportation and buses. Rail was always quite unique. It was always something that we were very keen on. But obviously being a government entity was not an easy thing to bring online. It was largely operated and a monopoly in that position. What we did with rail was we said, look, well, if we can't get the booking functionality because of just the evolution of that product in India, what we could do was build what we thought was a really seamless search experience for users out there. And I think Cleartrip had done a great job on that with other products. And so we built rail from a perspective of search and discovery. And then it was later on that the government opened it up and we were able to get the APIs and plug book into rail. But, even then it was always a fairly difficult product to build out, just given some of the complexities that were involved in working directly with the government and how they wanted to run the business. So we were always terribly excited about it, but it never really fulfilled the potential that we thought it had in our business, and I think, to be fair, in most other competing businesses as well. So it's a product that still has a lot of potential in my mind that hasn't quite been realized.
It's true. It's quite interesting. I mean, I asked you whether you were, what you were looking at the Expedias of this world and things like that. I mean, you had another, Make My Trip had already launched in India. I mean, was there anything that they had done that you kind of learned from, or you thought maybe we should do that slightly differently, given that they were the other kind of major competitor?
Well, I think in some sense it's probably everything, right? I mean, they had been in the US, and focused on that market for I don't know, 5 or 6 years. They pretty much got out the door a year and a half earlier than us in the domestic market in India. And obviously Deep and Kaya and gang have done an amazing job. From our perspective, we always felt that the product was the primary focus, and I think that's what Cleartrip kind of got known for, the experience, the user experience specifically, but the kind of I suppose innovations that we brought into the product. We always saw that as being very, very different to some of our competitors out there at the time. And of course, Make My Trip was out there. We had Yatra coming out at the same time as us. We had brands like Travel Guru, I don't know if you remember these guys, and a few others that were coming out at the same time. And many of them had reasonably, strong venture backing. So it was a different approach in terms of the product and how we wanted to build. We wanted to be 100% online. We didn't want to go offline. There were a lot of hybrid models that were being built out at that time. So from that perspective, it was very different. And then on the other side, you had this huge influx of capital coming in, not only into businesses like online travel, but I mentioned earlier the sort of new airlines and the explosion of the low-cost carrier industry in India as well. And that was bringing in enormous amounts of capital. So you had this sort of carpet bombing, for want of a better word, of India in terms of marketing, just driving new consumers online, or in some capacity to at least search online and maybe end up booking offline. And so I always felt that the product experience kind of got left behind in the search for eyeballs. And that's something that I think at Cleartrip we always felt quite focused on, and hopefully that's reflected in what we ended up building.
Yeah, interesting. Dave?
I wanted to quickly just ask a follow-up there. You said you guys resisted becoming a hybrid model, and I know Uber had to change a lot of the way they operated when they entered India. They couldn't be fully digital. They had to accept cash in some form or fashion. How did you weigh kind of meeting the market where it was versus forcing the market to move with you?
Yeah, for us that was quite easy because we just took a completely negative view on the offline market, right? So our view was that that offline market was coming online. There was a significant amount of investment being made to bring people online, whether that's, as I said, through supply or through competitors or through other emerging digital businesses. And our job was to really serve those customers in an online environment. Now, that didn't mean that we discriminated against other people. It's just saying that that was the focus of our product. And we felt that if there were more than enough people catering to that sort of hybrid online-offline challenge in India. For us, it was very much about once they're online, then they become a target customer of Cleartrip, and that's how we focus on it. And we did. It's not like we didn't try, right? We had agents. We've done a whole bunch of stuff, right? We had agency models out there. We've got a variety of different sort of corporate models out there. Cash as a payment, etc. A whole variety of different sort of payment options, EMI, etc. But for us, the thing that's always worked is just that very, very singular focus in the online customer and working with them directly.
Now, Stuart, I'm not entirely sure of my kind of search engine history when it comes to India. I know a lot about how Google has kind of come to the fore in North America and Europe, of course. I mean, can you talk us through kind of customer acquisition back in the early days when you were, you obviously a consumer-facing business? So how were you trying to get people in through the front door? Was it through traditional search engines or a search engine, or were there other methods that you used?
It was, in the early days, very heavy in traditional offline marketing. I remember, so when we launched, the day we launched, we took out a full-page ad in the Times of India. And for those that don't know, Times of India is the largest English-speaking newspaper in India. And it was literally sort of launching Cleartrip. And it was also heavy monsoon at that time. So, and we I think by 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, the site hadn't gone live. We were coding and trying to get this thing up largely because this full-page ad was coming out, in literally an hour's time, and every Times of India across the country. And we managed to get it out by about 5:30. Exhausted from sort of 48 hours of just trying to get this stuff off the ground, and then nothing happened. Literally nothing happened. I mean, we thought at that point that was job done, right? Take out big ad, put site up, 2 will marry with each other, and everyone will get it. And nothing happened. And that went on for about 6 hours. And then we got a knock at our door. And we were really living in a very obscure place in Bandra, up in a certain part of Bombay. We got some knock on the door, bearing in mind that it was flooded outside, pouring with rain. And there's some guy, so we open it, there's some guy standing there wanting to buy a ticket. And just, that just said everything to me. It was like, maybe there's an awful lot we still don't know. But anyway, so our first customer was an offline customer who literally paid cash based on seeing an ad in the newspaper for Cleartrip, which was a pure online model. So that was the experience. But yeah,
so you had the office address on the ad, or was it on the site? And then he'd looked on the site and come to you physically, or?
Yeah, I think probably both. I mean, as I said, there was so much we didn't know. So it was just a recipe of how not to launch your business, basically.
So I'm fascinated by this.
So if I can follow up there, well, what did work then? Yeah, what did work? Obviously, that wasn't a successful endeavor.
Well, we made ourselves really hard to find after that. So, who knows? We could have been wildly successful in the first year, but no one could find us. So eventually, people were forced online to try and find us, I think.
So at that point, you didn't consider just opening a bricks and mortar travel agency for those waifs and strays who wanted to come and give you cash for a ticket?
It was discussed. It didn't last very long, but yeah, there was. I remember, most of our conversations used to happen, in the wee hours of the morning, and I'm pretty sure that was discussed.
So you did this one ad in the Times of India. Then what did you do? Did you just wait for a viral effect, or did you suddenly realise that maybe you should try other methods?
We dug, and look, this wasn't just us as well. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot going on in India at that time, and so we had a pretty a comprehensive relationship with the offline media. We invested, quite heavily in things like TV at that time. If you go back on, YouTube, you can see some of our first sort of TV commercials. But it was an expensive process building, these types of businesses back then. And obviously later then, online and search marketing and everything else become much more prevalent. But I would say, in the first few years, it was very dependent on partnerships. And those partnerships were everywhere, right? I mean, at the time, you had all these new airlines coming in that wanted to partner with people like ourselves to just drive their own stories. So from that perspective, there was an awful lot to talk about in the offline media world, and it was quite interesting. But then you just kind of got incredibly creative. I mean, we had ads that, people were winning cars, if they booked on Cleartrip, and all sorts of strange things going on. And there didn't seem to be anything off limits in the first few years in terms of how to promote your business in India. So it was a very odd time in that sense.
In a way, that does kind of mirror the history a little of lastminute.com. They, Brent and Martha were very much into their kind of doing things slightly differently to raise the profile, arguably. And, so I suppose because you had other competitors, was that a deliberate strategy to do things slightly off the wall, perhaps?
I would like to say yes, but, I think, to be honest, we were all probably doing something quite similar. As I said, that seemed to be the only way to reach out to customers back then. So I think we kind of mirrored a lot of what was going on in the offline print and TV and everything else, as I said. I think the distinction between Cleartrip and others really came to when people came online, the kind of product experience we had. Ours was a very simplistic, all we obsessed about at that time was getting people through the purchase path as quickly as possible. As I said, the internet infrastructure was very choppy, the payments infrastructure was very choppy, and so we wanted to create as minimal fuss and as limited failures in that experience as we could. And that's why we had this very sort of pure interface that was very functional, almost like a utility in probably a better term, than some of our other competitors out there that were very intimidating in their experience, right? The sort of flashing ads and colors and everything else. And I think in hindsight, I think the Indian consumer probably responded more to the masala, if you like, that was available on lots of these sites than the sort of clean, pure, functional site that we had. We would get emails basically asking us whether we had finished building it yet. So that's how out of touch we were in some ways. But as I said, later on, I think it became our clear USP. But early on, it was, if I book on your site, will it work? Because, there's no colors on it or anything. So we were almost compelled to put a Colgate ad on there or something.
That's quite crushing in a way, isn't it? If someone says to you, if you finished building it and this is your shiny new toy.
Yeah. But by that time, we'd been battered so much that really we were somewhat immune to these types of things.
Okay, David.
Yeah, no, I have a pretty simple question. Do you have any other lost in translation moments like that? I feel like these are great gems, and I feel like one of the reasons we're doing this is because so many travel founders can't imagine parts of the travel industry that aren't derived from their backpacking around Europe in college, or parts of the world that they haven't lived in. And just like anything else on the lost in translation moments?
Oh, there's. Put me on the spot a bit here now. I mean, I go back again to those early days, and I think once we got our first round of funding, so we raised, I think, our first round of funding in about September 2005. And the first thing we did was we said, right, we've got to, there was no really strong technology on the ground in India at that time. So we thought, well, the answer to that is to go and get sort of best in class technology from the US. So, which is what we did. So we partnered with, I won't say their name because it might all end up horribly, but we partnered with a technology provider in the US that was being quite successful in providing to airlines and travel businesses. But we were so irrelevant that we were the last thing on their priority list. And of course, the time difference meant that every one of our conversations was happening at pretty much 3 a.m. India time. And so again, within months of partnering with these guys, we put our first request in for sort of changes in taxation and various other things. And yeah, we just basically got kicked into touch, and then we got all stroppy, and that almost ended up in our first legal encounter before we'd even got off the ground. So I don't think that's ever really been resolved. And then we came back to India and said, well, look, we can't solve it using technology from a more sophisticated market. Maybe there's something in India. So we found a B2B product that was there, but really that wasn't scalable in a consumer term. So we ended up sort of re-architecting all of that. And then that lasted for about, 3 months. And then we just threw everything out and said, look, we just got to try and build this from scratch ourselves, because it's the only way forward. And I'm glad we did that. But we then took the great decision to build everything in Lisp as a coding language. And what we didn't know at that time was there was literally only about 3 Lisp engineers in the whole of India. So after we had, that story about getting the business off the ground and putting it out there for that launch and that newspaper ad that was coming out, we then tried to scale in Lisp, and literally we already had all of those 3 engineers. So every day we would come in and say, don't you have any friends? What do you guys do? Just hire your friends, right? And they would go, yeah, but nobody likes Lisp. It's too intellectual, whatever. Anyway, so that ended very badly. So we then had to throw that out and then rebuild again in something that was, ultimately was the bedrock of what we did. So my point is, for the first year, we were a car crash of mistakes on how to build out the sort of, the technology and the functionality, as everything else is going on, right, in this crazy environment. So anyway, there's a lesson of what not to do, I think.
And when did you decide you needed to code everything in something else? Was it when there were no more people that you could hire to help you?
No, literally, that was it. That was it. I mean, either we were going to have to set up a university for Lisp, right? And subsidize all of these new people coming in, which seemed like a very big departure from the business model that we set out to do. Or we were just going to have to throw in the towel and try and build something a little bit more sensible. So yeah, that was it, right?
So tell us, you've raised 100 million. Talk to us a little bit about the differences from those early days when you were talking to investors about, the Cleartrip story, and how easy, or perhaps not easy, it's been in more recent years when you've been talking to investors. Obviously, you've got growth and you've got expansion and stuff like that, but the market around you is always constantly changing as well. So I'd imagine the investor questions are different as well. So can you give us a sense of the early days and what it's been a little bit more like recently?
Yeah, so I think back in 2005, 2006, you could have largely been selling anything online and raised capital for it. Because I think at that point, there was only one story, and that was this gargantuan opportunity of this billion-plus population that existed in India. And I think investors at that point were very keen to get into that story, although none of us really understood that sort of billion population and what it translated to in terms of transactions or users or anything else. It was just a very simple headline. And so raising money at the start, when I think about that Series A, B, and C type environment, was generally quite straightforward. But of course, it was nothing like the scale of Series A, B, and C that you see today, and you referenced earlier on. I mean, our Series A was 3.5, Series B was 8 or so, and Series C was a little more. But fast forward to sort of 2008, 2009, and you had seen this first wave of internet businesses in India, the Bazis of the world that got sold on to eBay, etc. And I think investors started to get a little bit more, had a lot more clarity as to what the Indian market was, where it was going, how long it would take to build. And that put a massive, and of course, that coincided with a lot of stuff going on outside of India as well. So that had a real impact on the scarcity of funding. And then I think the next round of funding, once the world corrected itself a little bit, became a lot harder. Because I think there were many different choices in India. It wasn't just travel now at this time. There were other businesses that were opening up that presented an opportunity. So there was more competition for resources. And I think investors the second time around were much more thoughtful around the kind of investment they were making. And so, you have to be able to demonstrate a sustainable and interesting business model, specifically in businesses like ours that have been out operating for a few years. We were no longer necessarily just the idea, which you can take a big bet on. We had, should, God forbid I say it, revenue and, EBITDA sort of stories playing out. And that had an impact on capital raising, yeah.
Or would there have been any kind of more pressure on you to perform and grow, given that, there was this, the BRIC economies, I think was the phrase that was often used, isn't it? Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and these super hyper growth countries that are going to fuel the next wave of the world's economics and things like that. Do you think investors were expecting you to perhaps perform better than they would have done in other markets because there was this sudden focus on the BRIC economies?
I think there was always an expectation that would be the case. I don't think I ever remember it being explicitly discussed.
Right.
But, I think that the very nature that they're putting money into these economies suggests that, they want to take advantage of that opportunity that everyone saw. And that, as I said, that translated into a lot of cash being available from many different sources. Yeah, I would say that probably in my memory that it wasn't so clear that that's what they were coming to do, but the undertone was pretty evident, I think. Yeah.
Give us your detail on the the decision to expand and focus, well, not focus, but also give as much focus as you did in India to the Middle East, which is, as we said in the intro there, it's where you live now, and it's a lot of the company is based there. What was the thinking behind that, given that some might say, well, there's a lot of potential growth in India, it's the second most populous country on earth?
Yeah, I think part of it was accidental and part of it was strategic. And so around the sort of time, around about 2010, there was a lot going on in India. We started to see this shift into mobile. And it was around that time that we put out, which was the first mobile product, which was a basic sort of HTML4 point-to-point domestic air solution. And, we were very bullish on the future of mobile. And again, rightly or wrongly, we felt that an overwhelming product experience would be the obvious choice for consumers, right? Because people moving, or certainly the early adopters moving from offline to online, or even from desktop to mobile, were going to evangelize the high level of product experience. We were starting to see international brands now a lot more in India across many different businesses. So the benchmark in product experience got elevated substantially. And so we started seeing a lot of usage on our mobile products, and a lot of that usage was coming out of the Middle East, and to some extent our desktop as well. And we never really considered the Middle East. We were very focused on what was going on in India. Anyway, it got to a point where the sort of transaction volume coming out of the Middle East was meaningful. So we said, look, let's just go in and set up a small team on the ground there that we could support those customers. And that's what we did. So we set up in Dubai. And then on the sort of flip side in India, we started to see a new phase of hyper investment and hyper growth. And, rightly or wrongly, we just didn't have the culture within Cleartrip to be able to compete with what was going on in the ground in terms of, investment to acquire customers. And I think in many ways, what we saw over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years was just this huge investment in customer acquisition around things like accommodation and just, specifically around accommodation. And that just made it very difficult for us to go toe to toe with our competitors. We had a set of investors that were, I guess, more conservative than others. And, despite us for a period of time sort of saying, let's not give up the opportunity that we've created, we weren't really able to do that. So, we have a very pure product view on things. We had early signs of life coming from the Middle East. We had the realization that we didn't have the balance sheet or the appetite amongst our investors to build off what we had built in India and go toe to toe, because that was going to cost a lot of money. And so all of those things kind of got us to have a bit of a rethink. So we built out finally all of this technology that we thought was unique. We built out a great set of products and features in our business, stress tested under a very demanding Indian audience. And if we couldn't expand in the Indian market in the way that we wanted to, we sort of said, well, look, is there an opportunity to take this technology, product, feature set into other markets that perhaps are not demonstrating anything near the sort of competitive intensity of India, and use that as a growth engine rather than the very expensive growth engine in India. So that was really what led us into the Middle East. And once we got into the Middle East, we realized then that there was a big opportunity, specifically within the GCC and MENA generally. We obviously the Expedias and the bookings, et cetera, were there, but they were largely servicing an inbound market into those markets. But within the GCC and within MENA, there was an enormous amount of travel going on. And of course, there's an enormous amount of travel from South Asia into the Middle East. So we started focusing on trying to connect the dots within the GCC and MENA, whilst leveraging the fact that our brand and the corridors of travel between South Asia and the Middle East was something that we were already very, very active in. And so it just made sense to build that out and take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. To clarify here, so it sounds like what you're saying is that the Middle East travel market was a lot more nascent than India. So you were kind of able to run somewhat of the same playbook that you did in India, which is product going a lot farther and being able to spend minimally on customer acquisition costs through search engine marketing, et cetera. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I would say in many ways it was probably a better market for us because there was perhaps a slightly different type of user profile. There was higher spend, so the unit economic story was better. The customer acquisition behavior was very, very different, again impacting the unit economic story. It was relatively well served in terms of certainly core markets like the UAE in terms of penetration and how sophisticated the online environment was, and that played into how we thought about customer acquisition. If I go back to India, it was brute force, offline, very expensive traditional media. When we came into the Middle East, it was very brand focused, but you were dealing with very concentrated pockets of customers. So again, and the things not to do. When we went into the UAE after about a year or a couple of years, we took out what I think, and I've made a bit of fact checking here at the time, was the world's largest outdoor media sign. So basically, we just put a wrap down this skyscraper on Sheikh Zayed Road saying, Cleartrip and all sorts of things. Now, that got a lot of strange eyeballs at the time, but it really helped propel us in those markets. And Cleartrip as a brand, rather than just travel as a search term, became very active very, very quickly. And that had a whole sort of impact on how we built out our online marketing and just basically the efficiency of performance marketing in the region. That was specifically for the UAE. Obviously, when Saudi was a very different market, and some of the surrounding GCC markets had nuances of that. But yeah, it was all of those things, right?
So could you say then that the banner on the skyscraper there was your Times of India moment for the Middle East?
Yeah, although fortunately, nobody came and found us. Everyone went online.
Things have moved on. Things have moved on a little bit by then.
Yeah, 8 or 9 years, we cracked it.
So, give us so you've launched into the Middle East. How do you view the root country where it all started now? I mean, how do you kind of focus or divide the focus around the business? What are you doing in that sense, given that the Middle East has been a success for you?
Well, if I look at our revenue today, our revenue is pretty much 50-50, right? So 50% of our revenue comes out of the Middle East and 50% of our revenue comes out of India. The Middle East is growing a lot faster. And so, over the next few years, that sort of relationship will change. But for us, it's very much a part of a broader story. And I think, the DNA and the experience that we continue to have of building in India, which is still very competitive, sort of leadership position I think we've taken in the GCC and to some extent MENA is half the story, if you like. And I think that when we talk internally, we talk about this opportunity in emerging markets. And for us, that emerging market geography is the sort of India's, Middle East, and Africa's of the world. And I think if we can, I guess we're 2/3 of the way there right now. So if we can bring that technology, which is an emerging market architecture and internationalization of our platform, the products and features that I mentioned earlier, if we can bring that to customers at the right time in those developing markets, I think there's a huge opportunity for us, because those products and features and technology are built in a way that is, I guess, consistent with the evolution of these markets. We very often see consumers in developing markets leapfrogging technologies, right? And going straight into things that are perhaps much harder to drive in more sophisticated markets. So how you think about the evolution of your business and your product changes a lot. And so for us, it's about making sure that we remain very relevant in India, which is a very important part of our emerging market story, continuing to build out on the leadership that we have in the Middle East. And rather like the relationship of these corridors of travel between South Asia and the Middle East, which gave us an entry point, a more efficient entry point into those markets, see how we can now take the combination of India and the Middle East and look at opportunities, in Africa. I mean, today we've got 300 odd people that sit in Cairo that do a bunch of stuff relevant to obviously supporting our Middle East business, but also at expanding, across North Africa and hopefully soon into other parts of Africa as well. So that's really how we see it. So it's not a pivot into the Middle East. It's a combination of these strategies working together that delivers what we think is an interesting emerging market story.
I just wanted to follow up on one word you used there, leapfrogging technologies. I remember the story of M-Pesa in Africa and how basically mobile banking actually caught on a lot quicker in Africa because they didn't have to deal with all of the existing infrastructure of banks and all that security. And I'm just curious, did you have something in particular in mind when you said, leapfrogging technologies that have to do with travel? Have you had to experience that, or do you think you might have to experience with Africa shortly?
Well, I think payments is a great opportunity, is a great example of that, right? And we saw that in India. I think in a more traditional sense, just the sort of leapfrogging of fixed line communication into mobile and how that exploded in India is another example of that. I mean, I think today something like 80 to 85% of our search volume comes through all of our mobile stories. And so, that's very, very different how our mobile web products will relate to our app products, right, in specific markets. Again, very, very different depending on the markets you're in. You look at the Saudi market, which has an enormously high social usage, things like Facebook, etc. It's got a very, very, very young population, but there is a real shift there from luxury to affordability. And, it's just changing the dynamic, I think, of how consumers interact. And again, we're having to relearn everything. You cannot go out there into these markets with these types of customers and, give them the same old traditional marketing story, right? You've got to develop very different types of relationships. So for example, we in Saudi, we partner with, through Fly-In, with the number one football team in Asia. And it's how we interact with them and their social audience that drives a lot of that growth that we're seeing. So there's still a lot to learn, but I think these are unique things that we're seeing in our market.
Last couple of kind of questions from us, really. I mean, we've spoken to a lot of founders that have been around for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. How would you say, just personally, you kind of I'm trying to think of the right phrase, just kind of keep the entrepreneurial juices flowing? I mean, why do you stick around in the job? Is it because it is your baby, in inverted commas, and you're keen to just see how far it goes? I mean, it's a tough ride sometimes, online travel, and especially when you're expanding. What kind of keeps you going?
That's a brilliant question, because we've been doing this a while, and I would say that we've been a startup in a number of different areas. So it's that period of becoming a startup, whether it's in Saudi, whether it's in the GCC, whether it's in India, whether it's what we're doing now in places like Egypt, etc., is an exhausting process. But I think personally for me, and don't get me wrong, I've had periods, in the 13, 14 years where I sort of said, look, surely there's something else I can do, or, maybe it's time to bring in somebody that's a lot more competent into the role and let them take Cleartrip forward and everything else. And I think on the latter point, I think that what we've been able to do at Cleartrip is build out a great team. And for now, I'm really excited working with that team, but I recognize there may be a time, and maybe that's nearer or than we know, but where bringing somebody else into my role would be the right decision to take it on. For me personally, I'm still very motivated. I kind of feel like there's unfinished business, and this emerging market opportunities I was talking about earlier, and how we the sort of internal narrative that we have at Cleartrip is something that I think we all feel very excited about. And as I said, I and the team, and it's very much the team, just feel that we haven't quite fulfilled the potential of Cleartrip, and we have a responsibility to do that. On a personal level, we've also got over 1,000 people sitting in 8 different markets that there's a responsibility to, and I think making sure that we put Cleartrip in a position where it can continue to grow and exist and expand in a logical and sensible way is important from that perspective as well. But there are periods where you need to check yourself in the mirror every now and then, or you need someone just to knock some sense into you, and that's happened less and less, more frequently, I would say, but certainly has in the past. Yeah.
Just the last one from me then, Stuart. I mean, do you wish in a way that you were kind of starting afresh now, given that there are these kind of large pots of money that people are willing to give travel startups there? I mean, there is a fairly well-known and fast-growing India-based accommodation company that seems to be making waves, and as we know, Ritesh has done quite well in persuading people to give him lots of money. Oya, I mean, do you kind of look on enviously that you wish you'd had that opportunity back then, or are you kind of pleased with the way you've done it?
Yeah, it's a tough one, that, isn't it? I mean, I think there are periods when you look over your shoulder a little bit envious of some of the stuff that's going on, and you kind of said, look, if I had a fraction of that, what I could do within the business that we've built, given how we built it. But those are just the realities, and I think what Ritesh and gang are doing is extraordinary, and we'll where that journey will go, no one knows, but we're all watching with excitement. I think I learned a long time ago not to get too envious and jealous, and just focus on what we have. And I think what we have is an interesting business. And if I spent my life looking over my shoulder, then I think my blood pressure would be through the roof. So for now, I'm healthy and happy and enjoying what we're doing.
Well, Stuart, thanks for joining us today. I think this has been super fascinating. I think for regular listeners, they'll be able to tell I've been doing a lot more listening on this podcast than once in the past. But anyway, this has been How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's podcast with Kevin May from PhocusWire and myself, David Litwak from Mozio. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Stuart.
Great, really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more insight stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages, and get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.